Awesome. So this is going to be a bit of a deep dive, not only into Web IDE, but a lot of the different editing experiences that we started to have accumulate over all of GitLab. I'm going to kick us off here with the single file view, because there's one very interesting aspect from the beginning on. You'll see that Edit and Web IDE are the primary and secondary button. And as you probably have also been involved in, or at least might have seen, this is something we just switched around recently. Previously, Edit was the primary, Web IDE was the secondary. And we just played around with it to better understand, will this actually drive any kind of different user behavior? Or if not, is that an evidence that users are making that decision more consciously? We were heavily discussing why people would use the single file editor over the Web IDE, or why they would use the Web IDE over the single file editor. And while for us, as the people who have worked on this, there are very specific reasons why I would go for one, we didn't know whether it was obvious to others and whether it was also in their best view. So just here, short screenshot of the single file editor, so everybody knows what exactly the single file editor is. The Web IDE in its most complex state, where you also have the pipeline on the right side pulled out. And some of the most popular quotes we got in the beginning from user research. Sometimes we use the edit button, sometimes I use the Web IDE, I don't even know why. And this is exactly what we came across in the beginning quite often. I tried to map the positioning of the different editor experiences when we started looking into it, to try to also understand what are the advantages of it. Single file editor, simple, everybody can directly use it, it's fast. Web IDE, it's multiple files and commits, so you can do more complex and more continuous work. But we never really were clear about who our target audience actually is. Like the fact that you can do multiple commits, that you can have pipeline view and everything, seems to point at the target audience of a developer. But the way we marketed it and the way we also talked about it was oftentimes giving non-developers an easier access to developer tools. And we had this deep divide between who do we actually want to focus on. One big drawback in the beginning was also that the loading time was quite long. For large repositories such as GitLab, it loaded many seconds, but we got this down to 5 seconds. So there's no real differentiation between like 1.5 and 5 for any kind of longer productivity. There is absolutely for the user's view and understanding of it, but technically there was not anymore. Other topics that came up in every kind of user research that we did around the Web IDE was, how can I move a file? We have different interaction patterns in the Web IDE than users are used to from any local IDE, because it's browser-based. And you don't want to know how often I saw users in user studies do a right click on a file and then be like, oh yeah, this obviously doesn't work, but I guess I thought, why not? Maybe they did implement it. And simple interactions like moving, renaming a file were very complex for people. It's something where they needed for moving to understand that they actually need to rename the file and then put the directory in front of the name. This was not at all intentional for them. And this is something where we saw drag and drop of items. We saw right click of items. This is something where us building this from ground up always held us back, because we would have to build this in extra and not relying on some kind of framework for this kind of activities from the beginning on was causing a lot of trouble. Another one, the different tabs. We often saw users who are not used to VS Code, even when they are more used to other kind of IDEs like Atom or similar local code editors. They were having trouble to really understand what do these tabs stand for? And interestingly, this is something even VS Code is currently looking into. There's an open discussion about adding labels to VS Code to the different tabs to make clear what they are standing for. We added tooltips because we saw that adding labels was tough for any kind of translation. But even then, it's still so incredibly complex to make any sense of what these icons should mean if you're not very deep in GitLab icon usage and the library. Like the fact that this is a review, that was not clear to anybody. And one phrase or one sentence we also heard often, it's pretty cool what you can already do. I like the fact that you can view pipeline and everything, but I need to see actually what's happening before I commit. And many people wanted to run tests. We had a terminal built in, but that was very complex to configure, and even our own developers had trouble getting it enabled. And even then, you could also have a live preview, but even that was only for, I think, Vue projects or very simple JavaScript projects. And it was not very stable, and it also broke a couple of times. So all of these aspects together led us to one issue that we opened now about 1.5 years ago. It was about replacing the Web IDE completely with Thayer. Some of the reasons were that a lot of the aspects that we were struggling with, like the interaction patterns, right click, drag and drop, everything would be built in from the beginning on because they are open source and rely on a framework that has all of this already covered. It also would give us more of the developer-focused features more easily, like server-side evaluation, linting, code completion. All of these aspects we had kind of on the roadmap, but not really, because we still didn't know what the target audience for the Web IDE was. And we weren't really sure, is that what we want to focus on? If we have it in the Web IDE, are we also going to bring it into the single file editor? And many of these questions are really what concerned us. We did a small proof of concept to actually see how Thayer could work. But what we really saw was all of these aspects I already mentioned a bit before, summarized, that could be solved. UI and interaction patterns, features, that's all nice. But we also have the amazing benefit of potentially moving dev environments into the cloud. This is what Gitpod has done, and Gitpod is heavily using Thayer, and they are even very much connected in the background. But it's going to bring you another kind of deeper level of Web IDE, basically, which would, when we look at the positioning, give us the chance to move single file editor even more to the left, make it simple, make it quick, and make the Web IDE Plus very flexible, very dev focused, but feature complete, so that users can actually consider moving a lot of their IDE work to the browser, to our own tool, instead of doing it locally. All of that happened while we also did small iterations. We started working on the dark mode, not only because we saw it was very helpful in the Web IDE, but also because we wanted to use this as a playground to understand how should the dark mode globally work. And we also were considering, even though that came a bit afterwards, removing the tabs completely. We saw that when you remove the tabs, and this is where Mike Nichols did an amazing job with the design, you can make things way clearer without actually taking any features or functionality away. You can also give more of the information in stages only when you need it. For example, we oftentimes had a problem that users made a change and suddenly a new tab would pop up here. but the new tab didn't have anything connected to it. Like they didn't know what to do next. And if we kept this in one screen, in one flow, we were hoping this would make it way easier on users. Something that happened even way before of that was the staging feature that we removed. Before, we had a differentiation between stage changes and unstaged changes, but that just led to a lot of confusion from different users and a lot of confusion also when, for example, deleting a file would move it to stage changes. But when you in the same commit change a file, that would keep it in unstaged changes. So when you then actually commit, you only commit the staged changes, and people weren't really understanding what the difference between unstaged and staged changes is. So we got completely rid of it. We had very, very little feedback from people that actually used it. We looked at the data, and I really hope I'm quoting the correct data here, but we saw that only 0.03% of all commits used the staging feature. And that's just so tiny that we didn't really wanted to make such a feature cause potential confusion while not being that valuable. While we looked into Theia and everything, Codespaces came out. And this is really where we kind of were in a place of, we were still very early in the proof of concept phase. We decided pretty much against it. And this was the nail in the coffin, because to get to this state of where GitHub already was and to get to basically the web IDE be the same thing as Codespaces, it would have to be a huge investment. And we knew if we wouldn't completely stand behind it and put all of our efforts and resources into it, that would not be something we could really do. So instead, we collaborated with the Gitpod team and tried to get an integration into place to actually make the same functionality available to our users, but as an external service.
I'm just going to pause you there. Are we okay for time?
Absolutely.
Do you need to pause for a minute?
No,
okay.
More than okay. Still got a couple of minutes. And just to give everyone who views this presentation and doesn't yet know exactly what Gitpod is, this is what it looks like. You have the code editor, you have the file tree, very similar to the web IDE, but you can run everything in the terminal and actually see the preview of your code and the output on the right side or in another tab. So we added this to our usual UI, made this a choice between web IDE and Gitpod, and got some amazing feedback from users who thought it was really, really valuable. This brought us to a very interesting point, because suddenly we had this web IDE Plus that we were talking about that is flexible, dev focused, and complete. We had the single file editor still on the left side, but we had in the middle the web IDE that suddenly was in a weird spot, because when you have something positioned between two extremes, it's almost always a bad spot, because you cannot, you have such a tougher point of argumenting, why should I use this product over this and over this? You can always easily argue for why should I use this product or why should I use this product? But for arguing something in the middle, it's really a bad spot, and we needed to get it out of there. So what we ended up in a lot of our discussions and thoughts is still plan and in progress. Nothing of this is set in stone, but these are the couple of ideas we really came out with. The first one, and this might be a bit surprising, but we wanted to focus on the single file editor, because we still saw that even though it's located on the left side, single, fast, it still wasn't single and fast, simple and fast enough. What we noticed was that especially in merge requests, the single file editor is a huge pain, because when you have 25 different files that you're working on, or you're working on just one file with 25 different changes, if you want to make a change, you click on editing on the pencil icon, and it brings you to a completely new screen. You get thrown out of the context. You get into a completely new state. And then when you even made the change and move back, you have to completely reorient yourself. This is not good. And what a lot of people did as workaround is instead hacking our suggested changes. They would make a suggestion and apply it themselves. So they basically did the same job of editing something in a merge request, but then coming out of it and having that change applied directly via a suggested change. And this is awesome because we see we have enabled a workflow that we understand people need to use. But at the same time, it's not the workflow we want to push people into, because they shouldn't have to hack suggested changes to get to that outcome. So the main problem really here is you lose context every time you have to jump to the single file editor or to the web IDE from one page. So instead, something that the team was looking into is inline editing. And Dennis Mishunov did an amazing job with the proof of concept on snippets. You can see here, there are two files in this one snippet. And if you want to make a change to one of these files, you can just click on the edit button, make a change, save your changes, and it's reflected directly. You stay in context, you directly make a change, nothing you have to move away from. You don't have to open two tabs to work simultaneously. Everything is right at the place where you need it to be. This moved the single file editor even further left. So while we still were wondering what exactly are we going to do with the web IDE, we knew that we had positioned the single file editor already on the further extreme. And this is something that's a good change. I now need to pause this for a second. Perfect. So this puts us now back into the center of where should the web IDE go? And this is exactly the question we asked ourselves, and where we still don't have the perfect answer. But something that we looked at more and more when we were deep in that discussion was, what are the situations actually where you need to switch between multiple files at the same time, where you need to have an overview? What's the area where you need the closest to a code in your local editor experience, but you actually don't need a local code editor? And what we really came out with is the file view in merge requests. It's very interesting because the code review team already implemented something that is so incredibly similar. We have the file tree on the left side, scoped only to the changes in this MR, and you have the file view on the right side. And you can scroll or you can use this to navigate, but it's super close to what we have as a UI pattern in our local code editors. And what we were then looking at is how are users currently using the web IDE and merge requests. We already built in features that if you open the web IDE from a merge request, you have the changes highlighted. They will already open as file tabs for you, and you can view everything. But what flows are they not able to complete, and how could we use it to solve other MR problems? So we did some research around how can we, for example, keep the creation of a merge request in the web IDE. Super often users would go into the web IDE to start working on something, commit their first change, and with that commit, create a new branch and start a merge request. As soon as they did this, we kick them out of the web IDE into the create a merge request screen. This is very disrupting for them. We keep them out of the web IDE and they would have to navigate back afterwards. So we were looking at what would a potential flow look like if we kept them in the web IDE. We are also looking at how can we potentially show comments in the web IDE, because one aspect that is not visible when you open the web IDE from a merge request are all these tiny little file comments, not even talking about the larger comments as general comments in the conversations tab, just the comments on the individual lines of code. That would be something that could potentially be a huge benefit to users, because while they see the feedback, they could already start working on it. And so this is something we were looking at, which hopefully opens up the way for us to potentially position the web IDE more as a review tool, less as a code writing tool, but more focused around you can review the changes, you can review the code, or still make tiny little changes based on the feedback you've gotten. It's also very interesting that the VS Code extension has become more and more of a focal point, because a lot of the problems and ideas we have for the web IDE are exactly the same as we have for the VS Code extension. Displaying merge request discussions, displaying line changes. All of this is something that could both be beneficial to the web IDE as well as the VS Code extension. So by doing this, it hopefully enables us to get the web IDE out of this conflict state here, where it's in the middle of two different experiences, and levels it up towards an entirely different workflow. There still are a lot of questions and there still are a lot of open aspects to this. But this is something where, when we saw how we currently position Gitpod, and when we saw also how Codespaces is positioned, we knew that moving the web IDE into this developer-focused state would always have limitations unless we completely rewrite it. And moving it into a fast and simple way would also always have limitations, because it is always going to be a new page, a new context, and it's going to feel like you're in a different product, which is exactly what we want to avoid when we look at inline editing. So this focus on code review could maybe help us solve this conflict and instead create a new benefit for our users, and helps us not to basically throw away the work we have done here. We might need to reprioritize some aspects in the web IDE, such as questions such as, are we going to keep the pipeline overview? Are we going to keep the terminal? Are we going to keep the live preview in there? These are all things we need to look at if we do move it into more of a review focus. But that's how we, from a UX standpoint, basically ended up with this.
Thank you very much for that.
No worries. Any questions? Anything you want to dive deeper into?
Yes. I'm just thinking where to start here. Um, what's your views on launching Gitpod from like the web IDE to kind of as a solution on, what will my changes look like, to actually like use the Gitpod versus live preview as a tool?
I like that idea a lot. It's very interesting, and we need to consider switching from one editor to another. Potentially even also looking at, if I have it open in Web IDE, how can I launch VS Code, for example?
Mm.
These are all questions that I also have and that I'm not 100% sure yet on how that's exactly going to work, because there's also potential conflict. If you open it in the Web IDE, and if you don't actually have Gitpod configured correctly, what you end up with is basically a better code editing experience, but not the live preview.
Mm.
There still might be people who then are going to use the terminal to set everything up if it's a small project. But if we look at, for example, the GDK, if I would look at a review for the for GitLab here, and we wouldn't have the Gitpod GDK in place, and I launched this, is this really going to be helpful? And is this really going to be worth the extra move and the extra step that users take? Or should we check whether they have Gitpod correctly configured so that they can actually get an extra benefit out of it, which is seeing the product and the changes live?
Mhm.
Second question I have around this also is, we have our own feature that's very close to this, review apps. How can we maybe connect these better to the Web IDE to get to the same end goal of seeing the product live while also having the code changes in here? The difference would be that if you have Gitpod configured correctly and you review it, you can already make changes and see the outcome. Whereas for Web IDE plus review app, it would be just seeing the change before, and you would wait for the new review app to be finished before you can see an actual change. But these are all the questions and thoughts I have around this.
Mhm. Yeah, what I really liked here was like looking at the different use case of these things and coming from the static site editor. One thing that I noticed that we were doing is that we were like almost stepping through the same hoops that other teams have stepped on in the past, i.e., starting in one view, jumping to another world, jumping from another world. And we had this intent of like, that's fine for now, but we're going to like keep it all in one world. And what you have right now, right in the middle here with the Web ID, I almost see this as like the foundation for like a structure. So like the right hand side potentially could be like the single file editor where we're thinking of having different editors for different file types. For example, if it's like a pipeline or like if it's mermaid diagrams or JSON data, you have like special editors for that. Whether if it's markdown, then it's just like a typing experience. The thing on the left hand side is also very interesting in the sense that it's like a file tree and it shows you your changes. This has potentially, I almost see the same way that we might be approaching swapping out different editors for the different types. Is like in different contexts, we could have different types of file trees. So one of the things that's kind of confusing might be easy for some, but like finding which files you've changed in the static site editor, like navigating the tree versus navigating the website is like one thing that has always been interesting to me, where coming from a CMS, you kind of have like just a whole list of things, not so much a file tree. And then you jump into the world of our handbook, and it's just like a file tree, and then you need to know exactly which file structure, but that kind of corresponds to a URL structure. So perhaps there could be like a flat list layout of finding files, which then would almost replicate common CMS systems with which a list of blog posts and stuff like that, and you change the parent directory. So this goes on to the fact that like by doing some of these improvements to make things fast and simple in the static site editor, I think it has benefits in both the web IDE and the single file editor, that some of the patterns that we want to introduce for fast and simple could benefit multiple worlds. And but like the underlying foundation structure of everything is there. And what you were saying with like potentially looking at like showing comments in line and things like that, like per line, would be really interesting in the sense of the static site editor. In that, like, imagine people leaving reviews, but instead of viewing in a merge request, you're actually viewing inline, like the rendered version. So it's very similar to Google Docs. Like, here's the suggestion, or here's a comment on this line, um, and that could be something. It's like a view of the same underlying content, but it's housed in this common structure. But yeah, and then you can always swap back to the code view, which would essentially be this or the single file editor. That's to be determined, but like that structure is there. Like we don't have three different ways to like create, edit, and commit or submit of changes to
Yep.
a repository. You have like a common pattern. There might be tweaks here and there depending on context on how granular you want to get, like bare metals, which feels more like the web ID in this, in the comparison of a static site editor, single file editor, and web ID. But yeah, like I almost see that like that there isn't A versus B, as in like I don't see much difference from the web IDE versus the single file editor besides the tree and handling multiple files. But if that's, maybe I'm missing something, but to me, when you showed me the merge request stuff, it's like, yeah, essentially that's web IDE in single file editor land. So yeah, maybe if you could clarify that angle where I'm seeing that like there's just one, mm, like why would we have, like what can the web IDE do that the single file editor can't do?
Yeah, this is exactly the main question we asked us in the beginning. And this is where I feel like we need to, let me go back to one screen, become better at guiding our users. We have here now introduced this dropdown that starts to give you a reason why you would choose Web IDE over Gitpod. Quickly and easily edit multiple files versus launch a ready-to-code development environment. It's still not the optimal state. It's still not amazing guidance that directly tells the user which feature to use in what part. But what we need to become better in is, if we have these different experiences, guide the user to the correct one they should use per context. If we keep giving users more and more options, the ones that are highly invested into our products and that have complete understanding of everything we do will love it. But it's getting tougher and tougher for new users to onboard, and it's getting tougher and tougher for new users to actually explore all the different features we have, because they don't understand the flows anymore. So while we have in the single or in the file blob view currently the two buttons of Edit and Web IDE, this is something where we should look at, is that what we want to have in the future? Do we still want these two options basically be given here and only guide the user by making one primary and one the secondary? Or do we go more clearly into, we recommend you here to use single file editor. We take the Web IDE button away from this flow. You will still be able to access the Web IDE from other states, but we give users clearer options of what they should use because we have more clearly defined what are these options good for, when should they be used, and what is the target audience for this. If you have a user that's in love with the Web IDE, they will still find another way to open this. They can still open the Web IDE from the beginning on and navigate there. But we need to become better in making choices more simple for our users based on how we have designed and built our features.
Yes. This one's interesting. I think it goes to that point of GitLab being opinionated about stuff will help, the simplicity of using it. But like, when you're not sure ourselves, like that's why we're having this conversation, you end up in this situation where you're like, we're not sure, so you choose. And if we keep on introducing other things, I think there's been discussions around having like a recommendation or some configuration file to say, yeah, if these files like open up with this editor, if there's something else when it's like unknown, then yeah, default to something else. But
it's a great question actually, because what it really states is also that we don't go deeply enough into why are we building something. If we have built the Web IDE that could be used interchangeably with a single file editor, why have we built it? If we are not clear enough in what problems is it solving for the user, then we always get to these problems of, as you can see in this quote, even we ourselves didn't know how to answer this question. Even when I looked at my own behavior, I sometimes used the edit button, I sometimes used the Web IDE button, and I still had trouble assigning certain scenarios to when I did this. And I think it all goes back to being clear as a team about what problems you're solving and what workflows you want to enable and how you want to improve your user's life. As soon as you have that figured out more clearly, you know how to design for these kinds of states because you already have had discussions. What should be the preferred choice and what kind of workflow do users have here?
Yep. And I think that's a good like foreshadowing of things to come, because that's, I think, handling multiple file types is, it's a hot topic with our group, and yeah, with the pipelines editor group as well.
Absolutely. And there it's really amazing that Dennis and the team around Editor have done such a great job of introducing one basic code base around Editor Lite so that we can rely on this in multiple different contexts. That allows us to build these different ideas more quickly, but also have any changes propagate directly down to the other experiences. And that's going to be a huge benefit for us in the future.
Totally agree.
There are some other parts around Gitpod especially that we might need to solve in the near future. When looking at this screen, one challenge I've now come across many times is that the understanding of what is a Gitpod workspace from a mental model is tough for users. When they open Gitpod from this point in the UI, they will always create a new workspace that's basically fresh and that doesn't have any of the changes they made previously in Gitpod connected to it. This is something that especially non-technical users are having trouble with. They understand it as more of a, this is my one workspace in the cloud. If I open it today, I close it, I open it from the same space tomorrow, I expect to see exactly the same state as before in there. But
Yeah, I
that's
fall
not
in this.
happening in Gitpod.
Yeah, I fall in this camp.
Yeah. And this is something where, just to quickly show how GitHub is solving this, they have the similar part open with code spaces. But if you have an open workspace that you have previously worked in, they will show it to you here. You can either open the previous one or you can open a new one. This is going to be a challenge for us because we don't have access to the data in Gitpod in the same way as GitHub has access to the data of code spaces. So we'll have to think about how to solve this. But this is definitely another challenge that's coming from having this integration and from showing the different options in this way.
Interesting. Yeah, do you have an issue already out for that one?
Not yet. No, I was
Okay.
looking at the problem in the last couple of days myself, really for the first time, because I heard it so often that it really stood out. And yes, we should absolutely open an issue. I'll get that done right after this video.
Yeah, because looking at it, it's almost like this defaults to like a new environment, right? And I think the other idea is like to have another link or like potentially do another kind of flow where it's like view your existing instances and don't show the list, but it's just a button that takes you to Gitpod to like take you to that screen in Gitpod that has the list of the different instances that are probably sleeping because it's been a while, like over like X amount of time, and then you can guess from there, and that be like better than this where there's no way for you to actually jump to that list from
The,
here.
the question is, right now, without introducing any more code changes, could we even access that data at all? Whether a user already has existing workspaces for this project? Or are we going to show it basically regardless of whether a user has ever opened Gitpod? Because this is something where I don't think we currently have the API set up in a way that it reports back to GitLab what you have done in Gitpod.
Mm-hmm.
And this might be something we also need to pull the Gitpod team in.
Mm.
But yeah, we should
Yeah.
definitely have that discussion in an issue. There are absolutely different ways to solve it,
Mm-hmm.
but we might need to make a couple more changes to solve this one problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's an elegant solution and there's like a quick and dirty one where it's like you click this button before, you probably have one instance somewhere and we just
Yeah,
yeah, anyways, yeah, we can discuss further in the issue properly.
absolutely.
Let's see, any other questions? I found the direction of removing the tabs was interesting because right now within the editor group we're discussing consolidating the tabs. So the review and changes tabs into one. But like there's this other execution of no tabs, which is interesting. Like it's, to me it feels it solves the problem of like what's going on, but maybe it doesn't work as well when it's collapsed. But yeah.
And this is also an interesting one because what I like about the design on the right side is that it allows us to be more progressive in our disclosure of information. When you open the web ID and you have no changes at all, we just simply don't show that section at all. You just have the files. And the one piece that Mike especially looked in deeply and that we still haven't found the perfect solution for, how are we going to deal with the commit button? Should we keep it on the bottom? Why is it on the bottom? Like previously, it made a bit more sense. Here, it should maybe belong in here because it's actually committing the changes and it's not committing anything else. Maybe it should belong in this icon list, icon section here, because it's also an action. There were many different ideas Mike worked on, and all of them had certain advantages and disadvantages. And he really did a great job going very deep in iteration and trying to figure out what are the different ways we can solve this. But yeah, we left it in this design at the bottom because even when you don't have this section at all, it still gives you a sense that you can not only view files, but you can actually make commits and changes from this UI. And that was a big part that otherwise wouldn't have been enabled. So while we probably would have to leave it disabled as it currently is when there are no changes, having it visible in the UI, even though there are no changes, is still something we didn't find a better solution for yet, even though we weren't 100% satisfied with where it's located here.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think Mike Nichols sent me some issues to look at in the past, but yeah, this rehashes that, and I'll probably schedule a one-on-one with him to understand or just see some of the other explorations. So thank you for that.
No worries. And as the web ID also has gone through a couple of hands from a design perspective, Dimitri worked a lot on it before me. I took it on for about a year. Then Mike Nichols took on the focus of the web IDE for quite some time. He might even have different aspects in his subjective view of what he would like to focus on. So I think it would be a great idea to also check in with him how he sees all of this. But I wanted to give you a kind of even further, even deeper look into what previously has happened and why we have come to certain points.
Very good. No further questions at this time.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I'm just going to stop the recording now.